أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. To the dear viewers of the MKSI Leicester YouTube channel, Salamun Alaikum wa Rahmatullahi wa Barakatuh. And Sheikh, Salamun Alaikum and welcome to the seventh session in the series titled An Exposition of Ashura. How are you doing, Sheikh?
Alaykum salam wa rahmatullah. Alhamdulillah. How are you?
Alhamdulillah, I'm keeping well. I'm keeping good. So, to the viewers, we shall briefly summarize what was discussed last week. So, last week's session, number 6, was a session on the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. And of course, we discussed the number of companions that were martyred in Karbala, which we discussed was 72, and everything else has other connotations to them. And we also discussed the ranks of the companions that passed away and were martyred in Karbala compared to the ranks of the believers that were martyred in Badr. And finally, we finished discussing the companions of Imam Hussein alayhi salam through the discussion of the special qualities that they have, namely Basira. So, going on to tonight's session, number 7, the subtopic of tonight's session is titled Trends in History. So, Sheikh, to start us off in this subsession titled The Trends in History, are you able to introduce the topic, but more so potentially answer why it's so important to study history? Why do we not just focus in the future? And what's so important on going back to history time and time again?
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى اللهم على محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله. The topic for tonight's discussion, trends in history. It's a very, very interesting topic. You have to understand that, right? It's something that has grabbed the attention of many of our ulama, and many volumes of books have been written on it. Many series of lectures have been given on it as well. It's interesting because it approaches the discussion from a Quranic perspective. And as you'll see in a moment's time, the whole concept of history, the way Quran presents itself, is something which is it's eye-opening. So the idea behind this is that when you look at the Quran has many stories of prophets that have come before us, many nations that have come before us. Now, that's not to say that the Quran is a book of history. It's not. The Quran isn't a book of history. The Quran, what it does is it's a book of guidance, right? The Quran is a book of moral. It teaches us how to live a moral life, a godly life. But it uses examples of previous nations. It uses examples of previous characters that have come before us. So it talks about prophets. It talks about the enemies of the prophets. It talks about certain, for example, despots and tyrants. It talks about certain individuals of why they failed. Even it talks about certain individuals who are not considered to be prophets, but they were godly individuals. Now, the whole purpose of this is to try and integrate within our lives the qualities that they had so that we can seek perfection, so that we can seek success, and at the same time to try and deter taking on qualities of people who are damned by the Quran. Right? Now, what the Quran does is it famously mentions certain ayats where it talks about saying that history tends to repeat itself, that there is a pattern in every generation, there is a pattern in every era which tends to repeat itself, which tends to somehow manifest itself in different ways. Now, the centrality, the core of it, the essence of it is exactly the same. The agents of it are different. The clothes that the people wear are different, but the ideas are the same, right? The actions are the same. The vision is the same. So that's what it means when the Quran talks about how history repeats itself. And we'll come to these ayats in a few moments. So when you look at, for example, the history of Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam and his battle with Nimrud, when you speak about, for example, Nabi Musa alayhi salam and his battle with Fir'aun, Nabi Nuh alayhi salam and his people, Nabi Lut and his people, Shu'aib and his people, even the Holy Prophet of Islam. Even, for example, when you look at the prophecies of Imam Sahib al-Asri wal Zaman and how he will come back during the time of his Dhuhr, you'll see the same response being given to him the way it was given to Nabi Nuh, the way it was given to Nabi Ibrahim alayhi salam. So the style of the prophets, their tabligh, their message, the reaction of the people to their message, um, and how, for example, there is a minority from amongst them that accepted the truth, whereas the majority rejected the truth. All of that tends to um, repeat itself over and over again. Now, observe these verses in the Quran, right? In Surah Al-Muhammad, for example, verse number 10, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about how as human beings, fasiru fil ard, go into the lands, right? You've come across these ayats many a times. Fasiru fil ard, go into the lands and see the consequences of those who came before them. Allah wiped them out. And as for the believers, disbelievers, there is a similar fate. In Surah Al-Yusuf, for example, فَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ, in verse number 109, right? Look at the consequences of those who came before them. Again, the same idea is presented in Surah Al-Qaf, verse 36, right? We destroyed before them. Um, they thought they were powerful, but we destroyed them. They had no place to seek refuge from the adhab of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a reminder, right? The verse goes on to say, this is a reminder for those who are listening, for those who are full of intelligence, those who ponder upon history. So the whole idea of referring back to history and historical events is to try and wake us up, to try and make us aware that, look, there are certain things that we need to be wary of in our lives. Um, there are many things that we need to take lessons from. We are not perfect, right? We are fallible beings. Just because we live in the 21st century doesn't mean that we are more perfect than the generations that came before us. We tend to make mistakes as well, the way they made mistakes. The best thing that we can do is to go back into history, read the pages of history, see what brought success, see what brought, for example, damnation, and to rectify our societies, to rectify our individual lives based on that.
So based on this, now there are two spectrums to it. One end of the spectrum would say that history repeats itself. Whatever's happened, it's bound to happen again. At the same time, the other end of the spectrum states that every age is different. So there are different trends that happen in every time and age. Now, how do we reconcile these two ideas that, yes, history does repeat itself, but again, we've seen different trends that also occur?
So it's a very interesting question, right? So when you look at the whole the concept of trends in history from a Quranic perspective, you come across the ayah of the Holy Quran, right? Sunnatullahi fil ladina khalaw min qabl. Allah's precedence has come to those who have come before. وَلَن
Yes.
تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا, and you will not find a change in Allah's precedence, right? In a similar verse, different verse, I think Surah number 17, verse 77, وَلَا تَجِدُ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ وَلَا تَجِدُ لِسُنَّتِنَا تَحْوِيلًا. You will not find a tahwil, a change, a difference in our sunnah. Now, here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala terms history as his sunnah. Sunnah, often we translate that as a practice. The sunnah of the Prophet, the practice of the Prophet. What did the Prophet do in his life? What did he say? How did he perform ibadah? All of this is known as sunnah. But when you look at historical occurrences, this is known as a sunnah as well, right? This is the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's two major points here spoken of by the ulama. It's something that we definitely have to keep in mind. And that is that when we speak about the sunnah, you need to understand that the practices which have been determined by Allah are his choices. They're his words, so to speak, right? For every law in history is a manifestation of Allah's will. It's a divine rule. He chooses it, he appoints it, he determines it, he discerns it for mankind, for those people at that particular time. The second point is even more equally important, and that is, it doesn't go against the concept of free will. It doesn't contradict the principle of free will. When I sit and I say, for example, history repeats itself, some people may come and say, well, hold on a second. If history repeats itself and history is bound to reoccur again, then that shows that there is no fruits in free will, right? Whatever I do, for example, whether it be good or bad, if history is bound to repeat itself, then my decisions don't make a difference at the end of the day. The others say, well, hold on a second, if I do have free will and I do have, for example, the ability to make my own choices, good or bad, then this contradicts the Sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which disqualifies the whole authenticity of history repeats itself, right? The Quran answers this question beautifully. إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not change the people. He does not change the qawm, the nation, unless the people are willing to change themselves first. Unless the people make the first step to change themselves spiritually, then will Allah create change for them. It's not the case where, in our individual lives, it's not the case where I know I'm living a sinful life and I sit back and I say, Ya Allah, change me. Like, no, I have to make the effort first, right? The consequences, I can do tawakkul on God and leave the consequences in His hands. Now, the idea behind this is that whenever a nation pursues the right path, whenever a nation takes on godly qualities, takes on, for example, virtuous qualities, Allah makes that nation prosperous, right? The norms of history provide, for example, positive opportunities for people to grow with, um, and that is essentially based on the freedom of choice. Now, at the same time, if a nation, for example, throws away virtuous qualities and they throw away godly qualities out the window, and they adhere to satanic qualities, then obviously this will bring failure. Now, when Allah says, وَلَن تَجِدَ لِسُنَّةِ اللَّهِ تَبْدِيلًا, for example, you won't find a change in the sunnah of Allah, what that means is that it doesn't mean that I don't have free will or there is no concept of history repeating itself. It means that I, as an individual in a society, if first and foremost myself in my life, in the life of my families, in the life of my community, and more broader than that, in the life of society, if people work towards virtuous qualities, then there will be prosper in the community, in the society. But if people take on bad qualities, evil qualities, satanic qualities, then this will create a downfall in the community. And history, if you study history, you find that many nations from the very beginning, from the time of Adam alayhi salam, have taken on satanic qualities. And the reason why that is because it's easier. To fall into sin is much more easy than to train oneself not to fall into sin. Sins by nature, they're desirous, right? They are they're full of pleasure and they're full of desire, and it's very attractive from that perspective. So it's very easy. The default position of the human being is that he is pulled towards sin. We now have to try and work ourselves to not fall into sin, which is a very, very hard thing to do. So that's why you
on that point.
Sorry,
So
go on.
apologies. I believe on that point. I don't know why I'm hearing double voices. On the point that you mentioned, essentially, studying history allows us to develop principles and ideals and qualities which we inevitably see are unmoving. And although trends in histories change, it's that ideals that stay the same. So whatever's been good has always been good. Whatever's been bad, what has always been bad. And the verse you quoted, a similar verse, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, whatever good you do it to yourself. Whatever evil you do it to yourself. And if you want to improve the nation that you live in, look into the history. It's the ideals, it's the principles, it's the qualities that you need to adopt to bring about the change that you've been looking for.
Exactly. So when you try and bring all of this when it comes to the whole concept of Karbala, right? What's interesting is that whenever an event takes place in history, there are certain factors which are involved, which bring about the event itself. There are causes to that event, and then there are effects to that event. Now, all events in history, whether it be World War II, whether it be, for example, the different battles, civil wars that have taken place in England and outside of England, all of these are based on causes and effects. There were causes that led to it. There were effects that were created after it. Some of these events bring about good things. Some of these events bring about evil things, right? It depending on the movement, depending on the agenda behind that movement, the intentions, and so on and so forth. So when you have a historian, when you have people who study history, they're able to pluck out these informations. They're able to pluck out, for example, the different causes to a particular battle. They're able to take out the effects of these battles. You look at, for example, just recently, the whole incident of the economy collapsing. This has been a hot topic for the past until about 13 years, right? Since the collapse, the financial collapse in 2007. People, historians were physically, researching into history, trying to figure out what caused um, financial collapse in the previous, for example, centuries and the centuries before that. What caused it? What were the effects of it? Let's try and project the future based on these predictions, right? So it's good to know that you can always learn from history. Now, when you talk about, for example, Karbala and the whole issue of Karbala, the whole
Yeah.
saga of Karbala, right? Um, you find that at times when an event takes place, what happens is uh, individuals who are involved or a nation that was involved in that event, they can either behave in one of two ways. They can either, for example, um, mourn about it, create a holiday, so to speak, so that they can relieve the tragedy. They can mourn as a society, um, and something that will be remembered over the years, or they can learn from it, right? They can change policies, they can create a better system, they can prevent from whatever it was from happening again. Now, Karbala is an event in history. It changes the course of history, or it changed the course of history. Karbala in itself it was powerful enough to dispose of the Bani Umayyah, right? A regime. And it was so powerful that, the Bani Abbas used this as a platform to try and develop their power. So not only did it bring about uh, the collapse of the Bani Umayyah, but it kind of gave rise to the Bani Abbas as well. Now, obviously, the Bani Abbas, they had ill intentions, um, and the point was that they used Karbala, the whole idea of let's avenge, the Bani Hashim, let's avenge the Alawids, and get rid of the Bani Umayyah. It motivated, even beyond that, it motivated thousands and thousands and thousands, millions across history, to try and fight for justice, to try and give their lives so that people around them in society can have a better life. It is a visionary event, right? Not only that, even if you go beyond the worldly, dunyawi effects of Karbala, on the day of judgment, Karbala is such a powerful event that it will distinguish those who cried for Imam Hussein to those who didn't cry for Imam Hussein alayhi salam. Allah will give extra mercy, will be more compassionate. There will be shafa'ah for those who shed tears for Imam Hussein alayhi salam and lamented for him, right? So when you look at Karbala, Karbala is a beautiful historical event that there is so much to learn from. As a society, even a leader in society can learn so much from Karbala. Try and understand, how the leaders behaved in that time. Um, to even the commoner living in the West, for example, who has nothing to do with living in Najaf or Karbala or any, Eastern country for that matter of fact, he can learn so much from Karbala by just reading the biographies of the companions, because there is not a single companion except that we can relate back to them, right? You could be the most, for example, the outright sinner of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But when you read the history of Hud, for example, when you read the history of certain individuals, you develop hope in the mercy of God. So there's so much to learn from it, and so much that we can apply in our lives as well.
Having kind of established that it's the principles and ideals that we need to kind of learn from history, and that's what repeats itself rather than the trends that we see that come about it late afterwards. What sort of ideals and qualities or principles would you see in terms of examples of failures that you would have seen that this is what we've observed, or this is what the scholars have observed, and what points are there for that people should thereafter take heed of?
Right. It's a very good question. So when you look at history, scholars talk about how there were certain nations that came before us that had positive traits, and there is so much positivity from that that we can learn from and establish within our lives. But that's beyond the scope of our discussion. I don't want to talk about the positives. I'd rather talk about the negatives, unfortunately. But at the same time, scholars talk about the failures of previous nations, right? They talk about the failures of certain characters, the failures of certain personalities. And the Quran is filled with this. The Quran, from the first page until the very final pages, talks about the failures of previous nations. Whenever there is a prophet that is mentioned, the prophet who goes towards a nation, who propagates, who engages in tabligh, there is always, Allah's way of describing the reaction of that of the people towards the prophet, and that highlights to us. It brings about awareness that these are the characteristics that you shouldn't have in your life, right? So the first of these aspects which bring about failures of a nation is materialism. A person, an individual who is so engrossed in his own personal needs, his daily needs, he's under the influence of material things around him, right? This whole um, the whole concept of capitalism, he fails to see beyond what happens in his day and in his material affairs, for example. He's not able to rise above this. And when you have, for example, a person who is so engrossed in materialism, it naturally creates an intellectual vacuum. When you have people in a society who are driven by materialistic desires, you'll have a person who is working day in and day in and day out to buy, for example, £800 worth of trainers, right? Um, that's a problem because you're now chasing after things. Um, you're chasing after things thinking that it will bring you happiness, right? And you create an ideal for yourself. You create a vision for yourself, thinking that this is what I need in my life. This is where contentment lies in, right? You look at, for example, Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Imam Ali alayhi salam, when he complains to Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Nakhai, he physically, he pours his heart out to Kumail ibn Ziyad al-Nakhai. He tells Ziyad, he says, look, the community in Kufa, they don't understand my vision. From one perspective, they've not understood the priority in life, right? Imam Ali was a scholar, he was a thinker, he was a leader, he knew how to move his community forward. And one of the issues in his community was that the people were materialistic. And the Imam alayhi salam says to Kumail in a very famous hadith, he says there are three types of people: the one who teaches, the one who learns, and then you have the riff-raff of society, those who have or give no benefit in society whatsoever. So the Imam kind of highlights that, look, one of the major priorities that we should have in life is that we should gain knowledge. By gaining knowledge, you can understand your priorities in life. You can understand the importance of akhirah over dunya. When you have this godly concept in your mind, you're then able to move forward. But if you're just focused on the materialistic lifestyle, for example, then you've stagnated your own growth. When you have a person who's only interested in his own life, for example, how to eat, how to drink, what things to buy, how to provide comfort for himself and his family members, if he's engaged in establishing all of these things which are essentially cheap, and it's cheap because we don't know when we're going to leave, right? We could leave, before even going to bed tonight. And when you have this in mind, but you ignore it, that the real essence of our existence is not limited to this dunya. Um, and when you have a person who is, so focused in this, so engrossed in this, he's so engrossed in his materialistic desires, it makes him a prisoner to his immediate needs and desires.
Which at the end of the day is a state of mind, isn't it? Being materialistic or having contentment, they're both kind of states of mind. You can have the whole wealth in the world, but you may still not be content. But you can have a roof over your head and you can be the most content person. No wonder we have tradition saying there is no wealth like contentment. It's a wealth that never diminishes. And it's all to do with the mindset.
Exactly. So contentment, which is of course mentioned in the Holy Quran, right? The whole concept of itmi'nan al-qalb, it refers to the idea of contentment. And interesting, you mentioned, the word contentment. When you look at the whole idea of contentment and greed, when you have a nation that is greedy, when you have a nation that is fueled by greed, what happens is that you're not able to focus, you're not able to develop, you're not able to come up with new policies, new ideas to try and move the community forward. You're so much focused in trying to amass, for example, great wealth for yourself. This is just an example. Greed can manifest not just in wealth, but in many different areas. You're so focused on your individualistic self, you don't care about the people around you.
Yeah.
Right? Contentment is when you say to yourself, okay, you know what? I am happy. I am actually happy with what I have. Now let's try and move forward. Let's try and pass.
Focus the energy somewhere else.
Let's focus the energy somewhere else. Exactly. Let's try and come up with good objectives and goals so that I can try and at least move myself forward, move my family forward, move the people in the community forward. Contentment gives rise to nobler goals, right? In life and in society as a broader perspective. Um, if the ideals are limited, fueled by greed, then the objectives that come out of it is limited as well, or they're limited as well.
Yeah, certainly. At the end of the day, it just gives you focus on what you want to do. It's a story when Imam Rada was approached by an individual asking, "Why aren't you living as royalty?" And Imam Rada says that I'm not here in this world to live as royalty. I
Ah,
have a few duties and responsibilities, and contentment, of course, helps you reach that because you're now focused on what you're here for.
Ahsan, beautiful. So moving on from that, the
Yeah,
first
so
idea.
firstly, you mentioned materialism is one of the
Yeah,
causes of failure in previous nations that we can
right.
potentially take heed of. And of
Yeah.
course, that comes into Karbala. What would you say is the second point that the scholars state
The
is the driving cause of the failure of nations?
so the Quranic language behind the failure of nations, the second is following blindly forefathers.
Hmm.
Right? This is a key element and can be interpreted in many different ways. So you have many ayats in the Holy Quran where Allah literally damns people who follow their forefathers blindly. You know,
Yeah.
when the prophets came towards them and invited them towards Islam, and they used to say, "Well, Islam is not for us because we're kind of happy with what our forefathers have given us." Um,
Yeah.
and the prophets would reply, "Well, hold on a second. If your forefathers were really unintelligent individuals and they had no guidance and they were, tracking you towards the fires of hell, would you still follow them?" Um, in other verses, for example, the reply of the people would be, "Look, hold on a second. We don't want the message of Tawheed. We don't want to live a nice, holistic lifestyle that Islam is giving us. Enough for us is what we found within our forefathers, right?"
Yeah.
And the Quran says, "Well, hold on a second. Your forefathers literally they had no knowledge, they had no guidance." And this is something that was kind of repeated throughout in the time of Nabi Nuh, in the time of Nabi Ibrahim, in the time of even the Holy Prophet of Islam. The Prophet came and presented to them Islam, and they used to say, "You know what, we're happy with the worshipping of idols because this is the sunnah of our forefathers." Right? So, from a psychological perspective, what happens is that the development of society is prevented when people constantly hold back to certain figures in history. Our founding forefathers, for example, our founding fathers of this country, their words were written in gold, so we have to follow them. So hold on a second. They lived in a different era. They lived in a different
Hmm.
time. Yes, there are certain principles that need to be abided by, it traverses beyond time and space. For example, akhlaqi concepts, right? They don't change um, as time changes. This is perfectly fine. But when you look at, for example, the founding fathers of America, for example, they used to believe in slavery. They used to believe in capitalism. Now we're trying to understand that, hold on a second, slavery is not a very good, it's not something ideal that needs to exist in society. But in
Hmm.
those times, it was perfectly fine. Capitalism, people are realizing, how degrading it is to society, how it begins to diminish the position of society, and so on and so forth. So people are now trying to establish new policies, but at the same time trying to adhere to the policies given by the founding forefathers,
Yeah.
right? And the idea behind this is very interesting. So you have, for example, policymakers who, not even policymakers, even people in their own individualistic lifestyle, they try and create values in societies. They carve or they create a deity out of something which is considered to be a relative truth, right? And they use it as a stepping stone to reach its goal.
Hmm.
So, as an example, Islam comes and gives me an absolute truth, and that is the Quran, and that is the message of Islam, and that is a community that builds on the values of Islam. But when I take the values of my, for example, forefathers, and I use that and I treat that as a God, as godly, um, as a godly message, then all of a sudden, what happens is that as time goes on, I realize that hold on a second, it doesn't carry much weight. The
Yeah.
words of my forefathers, they don't carry much weight. Sooner or later, people begin to realize this. They begin to realize that blindly following the forefathers, um, it, it doesn't carry much weight in anyone's
Hmm.
life,
And Sheikh,
right?
if I may, on this brilliant point you mentioned on the forefathers, I guess it just shows the level of stagnation in the community, doesn't it? If someone is to say that I'm just going to do what my dad and my grandfather did for centuries, it just
Yeah.
follows the level of stagnation that they have. And then whatever you tell them or whatever the leaders tell them, they just blindly follow. Whether
Mm,
if the leaders tell them, like in the case of Muawiyah, slaughter a goat, just as the same way you slaughter the sheep, and they
yeah.
took that as a religious ruling. For someone to do that just shows the level of stagnation, and whatever you feed into them about cursing Imam Ali on the pulpit,
Yeah.
fighting Imam Ali, Imam Hussein, whatever you tell them, they'll just take it. And like you mentioned from the start, history repeats itself. It's this level of stagnated minds that we unfortunately still see today. Where, for example, in the issue of ISIS, the non-Islamic
Yeah.
state of Iraq and Sham, you tell them
Absolutely.
go murder, they'd murder. You go tell them go loot, they'll loot without even questioning what orders they're being given. And it's that level of stagnated minds at the end of the day of just blindly following. And which is why I guess the Holy Prophets, there's traditions, fiqh, jurisprudential. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Prophet himself states that there is no obedience to the creation if it disobeys the Creator.
Absolutely.
Um, yeah.
So it's very interesting. Even when you look at Yazid ibn Muawiyah, right? When
Mm,
even the Shamis or the Syrians that were there fighting against Imam Hussein actually said to them, "What are you doing? Why are you so adamant in killing us?" And
yeah.
the reply was, "Well, you killed the father of our leader." Yazid's very famous words. He said, "If my own forefathers were here to see this,
Mm,
um, they would be happy. They would be proud of me." And we spoke about this, right? We spoke about the
yeah.
intentions and the niyyah that Yazid had behind the whole movement of Karbala. For him, it was revenge, revenge
Mm,
which was based on the principles of his fathers and his forefathers, right? And it's such an interesting discussion, all of this, right? So when you have, for example, you know, policies based on what has been adhered to by my forefathers, what I'm doing is I'm adopting inferior ideals, right?
yeah.
And when I realize how inferior they are and how full of how flawed they are, naturally I become tired of it. Naturally, I lose interest in it. And so when you have an entire society that is based on inferior ideals, sooner or later they realize that, hold on a second, it doesn't carry much weight. And then they have no practical value, right? They don't bring about any good. Um,
Mm,
and then all of a sudden, you find that, it doesn't have any value in the long term. And the Quran talks about this beautifully. The Quran says, well, hold on a second. When you have a society that does not have strong ideals, strong values, then this will create confusion. This will create disunity. This will decay the state of that society, right?
yeah.
Society can become weak the way I, as an individual, can become weak. A society can die just as how I can die. Surah Al-Hashr, for example, verse number 14. Um, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you look at a community, that community, they will have bala, they will have adversities, and that adversity is great. From the apparent nature of it, you think that these people in this society are one as a whole, but their hearts are diverse, um, right? Because they have no unity amongst them. You look at a country and you think that because this person belongs to this country or these nation belong to that country, there's unity amongst them. Sometimes far from it, right? Their values may be so different, there may be no unity amongst them whatsoever. Whereas when you look at, for example, a different country, they're so proud of their culture, they're so proud of their language, they have iftikhar, they have pride in who they are and what nation they belong to. They may not be the strongest nation in the world, but because of that pride, they have unity amongst them, right?
Mhm.
Um, it's a very interesting discussion as a whole.
Yeah. So far we've discussed materialism and following your forefathers, which is
Right.
the epitome or the lessons that we can take from failed nations previously that we need to take heed of. Sheikh, is
Yeah.
there anything else that the ulama, that the scholars try and pick out as a negative quality that promotes that makes nations fail?
Yeah, absolutely. Tyrants, the presence of despots, the presence of rulers who bring people towards evil, oppressors who, commit acts of oppression, who violate the rights of others, of people in their the rights of their own people. When you look at, for example, the domination of tyrants, this is something that has existed from the very first day.
Hmm.
Um, Transgressing the rights of others. The first act of oppression was Qabil, the son of Nabi Adam alayhi salam, towards his own brother, right? Barely one generation of humanity in this world, and already an act of oppression um, was carried out. Why? As I mentioned, it's easy to carry out evil than it is to do good and to refrain from evil. That's why there is so much reward in it. When you look at, for example, a tyrant that comes into power, um, that stagnates the promotion, the growth of a society. What they're interested in is building their own power to make themselves more superior in the eyes of others, right? And they will do whatever the cost may be to try and subdue the people, to try and subdue the policies, to try and subdue growth within the community, just so that they can become more powerful. This is the pharaonic attitude, right? To impose their versions of power into the minds of the people. And you find that at times either society will stand up and fight, or society will be subdued for many, many decades. And we've seen both. We've seen both take place. Um, as a consequence to this, when you have tyrants and when you have despots, for example, in power, um, you see a couple of things. You see, number one, you see a battle between haq and batil, and this is again something that has existed since day one, right? Imam Hussein alayhi salam against Yazid. We have this phrase, right? Husseyniyat and Yazidiyat. It's a metaphor to explain the battle between truth and falsehood. We see it today. There is a battle against truth and falsehood. There is the battle of truth and falsehood at the time of the Prophet and in the time of the prophets that came before him. When the Imam comes back, again, there will be the great battle of truth and falsehood. When you look at, for example, oppression, interestingly, as a side discussion, we can go into this next time, inshallah. As a side discussion, you find that the causes of oppression, and oppression is something that has existed since day one again. Oppression, the causes of oppression, number one is jealousy. That's the root of oppression. You look at the ayah of the Holy Quran, for example, أَمْ يَحْسَدُونَ النَّاسَ عَلَى مَا آتَاهُمُ اللَّهُ مِنْ فَضْلِهِ. When Allah speaks about Nabi Ibrahim and the lineage of Nabi Ibrahim, He explains that, look, there are certain individuals in this world that I have given fadila, they have fada'il, they have excellences. We have given it to them. But then there are certain people, they are jealous of this, right? They are jealous of their status of these particular individuals. When you look at the Ahlul Bayt, for example, the Ahlul Bayt have always been victims of oppression because of the fada'il that Allah has given them. And their enemies know of this based on their characteristics, based on their qualities, their knowledge, all of these, they're based on their purity, their infallibility. People know for a fact that the Ahlul Bayt cannot be touched, right? when you look at, for example, the other causes of oppression is that the Ahl al-Bayt were the forerunners, the most purified, the representatives of Allah in this world. Interestingly, when Sha'bi was asked by he asked Imam Ali, sorry, when Sha'bi was asked about Imam Ali alayhi salam, right? And the question was, what do you say about Ali ibn Abi Talib? And he said, what can I say about a man whose followers have to hide his fada'il because of fear, and his enemies, and he says we have to hide the fada'il of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam because of fear. You know, his enemies, the enemies of the Imam alayhi salam are more willing to kill us by singing his fada'il, but at the same time, or because of their intense jealousy, right? Um, so you realize this when you look at the history of the Aimma alayhim salam. They were the forerunners, they were the representatives, they were the face of Islam, the most learned of their times. Famous sentence of, for example, the second caliph, it says, Lawla aliyun la halak al-umar, right?
Yeah.
And this carried on for many, many generations later. The same sentences were mentioned by Abu Hanifa. He said, Lawla, he said, if it wasn't for Jaffer Sadiq salawatullah wa salam alayhi, lahalak and Oman, if I would have perished, I would have not become Abu Hanifa the way people know me to be, as a great faqih, as a great scholar. So it's interesting how, because Allah has given them this fada'il, oppression was transmitted to them. They were victims of oppression, which is, of course, something that tends to repeat over and over again, primarily due to jealousy. So, as a conclusion, it's a very interesting discussion how history tends to repeat itself. The
Yeah.
three reasons as to why nations fail is because you have the presence of tyrants and how they act oppressively towards the people. Number two, materialism, which is something that we can all um, uh, you know resonate with. It's very easy to become materialistic, especially when you don't have, for example, spiritual advices of the Ahl al-Bayt within our lives. It's very, very easy to fall into these ideals of materialistic values, and to just go out and buy things, for example, um, and following our forefathers. This is something, and all three of these aspects can be very much presented within our lifestyle, right? We
Yeah.
don't necessarily we don't necessarily have to be tyrants sitting in the power of sitting on the throne. We can be tyrants in our own homes. We can violate the rights of our wives and our children, for example. That's something that is very much prevalent in our societies. The failure of a family is just a step towards a failure of a society. And all of this has been constantly repeated throughout the Quran, throughout the Sunnah of the Ahl al-Bayt, so that we pay heed to it. Karbala, the whole issue as to why Karbala took place is because there was major failure in society. There was a lack of vision, there was a lack of awareness, and in the end, um, the family of the Ahl al-Bayt was slaughtered one by one.
So, Sheikh, before we complete our conclusion, just as a way of summary, bearing in mind that we're now nearing towards the end of our session, for the benefit of the viewers, as a quick summary today on the exposition of Ashura, we've been discussing the seventh subtopic in the series, and this one tonight was titled Trends in History, where we've discussed why history repeats itself and what are the ideals and the qualities and the principles that tend to remain the same. Whereas there are different trends that happen in history, but more so we've spent a lot of time discussing the reasons for the failure in previous nations, and numbering them is, like you said, materialism, following our forefathers, and of course, tyranny. So, Sheikh, as a way of conclusion, would you please be able to conclude tonight's session for us, and potentially linking in our topic in mind of the exposition of Ashura, and how that relates to our topic tonight, inshallah?
I think what's very important to take out from this session is what I can learn as an individual from the saga of Karbala. There were certain values that the enemies of the Ahl al-Bayt had, and they held on to it, and that was failure to realize the importance of having good qualities, good akhlaq, failure to see the vision of Islam, failure to see how powerful Islam can be in changing society as a whole. We don't, we can resonate with Imam Hussein alayhi salam. At the same time, we can resonate with the characteristics of Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Again, you don't have to be sitting in a seat of power to have the same principles that he had. The one question that the ulama tend to ask is, well, if I was there, where would I stand? What, my actions, let my actions speak rather than my words. My words will say one thing, but what is my nafs going to say? Where am I going to be pulled and placed next to?
Yeah.
Sometimes we believe that, well, hold on a second, if the Imam was here with me, I would show him unbound loyalty, unconditional loyalty. It's like, okay, that's fine. That's beautiful. That's great to see. But, so the Imams, when they were there physically with their societies, they got very little support. When the Prophets were there with their societies, they got very little support. So it's easier to say it than it is to act out on it, right? Words are very easy. But what do our actions say? So when you look at the whole saga of Karbala, that event took place because certain ideas, certain disciplines and values were adhered by Yazid ibn Muawiyah. And then, of course, Imam Hussein alayhi salam stood up against that. He rose against it and he fought against it. Now, where do I stand? I should go back into history, learn from it, try and apply its message, try and apply its lessons in my life.
Well, thank you so much, Sheikh, for your time. And we will end it over here. We thank all the viewers for joining us. And inshallah, we will be back next week. Until then, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to accept whatever little that He had to offer. And more so, help all those that have been affected by the current pandemic and the lockdown, be it emotionally, financially, mentally, or otherwise. And finally, we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hasten the reappearance of the 12th Hujjah. And when He does so, then we do, through our actions, support him and be part of his ashab and ansar, inshallah. Jazakallah, Sheikh. Thank you so much for your time.
Ahsantum. Fi amanillah.
Fi amanillah.